Well, welcome everyone to the launch of the Oxus Society for Central Asian Affairs. Thank you so much for being here today. For those of you joining us live on the call and those of you listening to the recording, which we will be posting to the social media after this event. First of all, just like to say a round of thank yous. This has been a collaborative effort that's taken place over a number of months and really couldn't have done this without the input of a number of individuals. Firstly, to my wife, Eve, whose idea this was originally and sort of has been a driving force shaping the agenda of the organization. To Ben Dalton, our Director of Communications, who built our fantastic website that we'll be showing you today, that many of you have logged on and already seen. To Bradley Jardine, who's been an essential person working with us to shape our research agenda. To Sher, who you'll be hearing from later, and Aruke, who have both been fantastic researchers who've not only participated in the data collection that we'll be presenting later, but also in the analysis and the writing of the reports that we released on Monday. Also to our board of directors and our advisory council, who've really played a very active role in shaping our organization, its focus, and giving us very valuable feedback on sort of ways in which we can move forward as we develop as an organization. So I'm going to start by briefly introducing the organization. Then we're going to move on to talk about some of the data sets that we've produced. And finally, Nargis is going to speak a little bit about sort of the changing dynamics of the region and how Oxus could play a role in informing debates and knowledge exchanges in that regard. So Oxus, as many of you probably know from logging onto the website, new organization, a non-profit organization, a non-partisan organization based here in Washington, DC, but with a global network extending around the world. It's a research-focused organization dedicated to fostering exchanges of knowledge between Central Asia and the rest of the world. We have a number of goals, including, as I said, facilitating debate and exchange of knowledge, generating new ideas and knowledge-based solutions to the region's challenges. So how are we going to do that? Well, first, obviously, in the era of the pandemic, our presence is very much virtual. And so we have our website created by Ben Dalton that Ben is showing you now. And as you can see on there, we have obviously all the key information about the organization. On the landing page, we have our sort of the top articles that we've recently published. We have a number of sort of links where you can connect with us via the social media, via signing up to our mailing list. And we also have a number of publications that we're going to be discussing with you in a moment. So one way you can get involved with Oxus is to submit a publication. We have a number of shorter articles that are appear on our website that are 1,200 words long, and then longer research reports, the first two of which were based on the data sets that we released earlier this week. So if you're interested, you can send us a pitch for a short research-oriented article based on your research. So really what we want to do is provide a platform to established experts, but also early career researchers, scholars from the region, to present their research to a broad audience. So one way that we're realizing that is through the publication of articles, but another way we're realizing this is through the Central Asia Researcher Directory. So this is a searchable database of experts on the region, numbering around 200 entries and climbing, where you can enter your information, your contact information, your a brief biographical statement, and also keywords related to your research. If you're an expert on Tajikistan and extremism, then you can put those words in there, and then you can search. If you're a journal editor, someone looking for a consultant, someone looking for a research partner in a joint research project, you can search through the database based on certain keywords. And here you can see sort of the people who are working on, I think, Turkmenistan, for example, or Tajikistan. So it's a searchable database. The goal is to sort of foster exchanges between individuals and connect academics with other professional fields such as journalism. That's one way we're realizing our goals. We're also planning on organizing events like this one today, both events that are oriented towards an external audience, but also internal events for members of the Researcher Directory. To be a member of the Researcher Directory, we sort of have broadened the concept of an expert beyond sort of traditional scholars with a PhD You may be an expert who's a journalist, a human rights activist, who's working on the region, who's publishing articles and analysis of the region, and we would welcome you into our group. So you don't need to be someone with a PhD. You need to have sort of minimal graduate level of education to be publicly engaged and conducting research. And that's the sort of benchmark that we're looking for you to join. So please join. I know there's been a number of sort of concerns around researcher sort of safety, particularly for researchers, scholars from the region, certain countries in the region where being part of a public directory may not be something people are comfortable to do. So we are very happy for you to email us and to become part of our network by being non-public. So here you can see on the sign-up form, you can say that you want to submit your information to us, but you don't want to make it public. That would mean you'd be invited to our internal events, and you'd be part of the network, but not without being a member of the external facing directory. So the Central Asia Researcher Directory is really about sort of connecting people within the region, working on the region, and those interested in the region. So another sort of goal that we have is related to organizing training workshops, and we're going to be rolling out a number of those going forward. Our first is actually at the Central Eurasian Studies Online Week, where we're going to do a networking event focused on China's role in the region. But I think Nargis, and both Bradley and Nargis, will be touching on in their presentations. So please, you can find the information on the Central Eurasian Studies Society website or on our social media account, where we've tweeted out some information about that. So please join us for that internal event. How are we sort of framing the region? Well, we're obviously very interested in the region in and of itself. And we're also interested in sort of the connections, the position of Central Asia within the rest of Asia. So whilst we sort of recognize that ties with Russia and the West remain important, we're particularly interested in the ties from Central Asia to the east towards China, Japan, Korea, and to the south towards India and Pakistan. So we're framing Central Asia within the sort of dynamics of a re-emerging Asia, rising powers, and sort of emerging multipolarity. So that is one of the reasons why we've decided to include Xinjiang within our definition of the region, which has historical and contemporary linkages with the rest of post-Soviet Central Asia. I think too often, I guess, there's a legacy of sort of the Cold War and the sort of organization of academic departments, particularly in the United States. Eurasia and Central Asia is obviously lumped together with the rest of the post-Soviet space, and that remains sort of an important categorization, but we feel like there's a need to break down some of the boundaries between China studies and studies of East Asia, South Asia on the one hand, and Central Asia, and sort of bring those communities together. And that's why we've included, one of the reasons why we've included Xinjiang within our mandate. So briefly, just to finish before we move on to the next speakers, what are our core values and principles? Well, the first is pluralism, right? We're very interested in promoting critical thinking, independence of thought, and academic freedom. We want to give our authors and members of our network an opportunity to express their views on different topics freely and in a critical manner. In that light, we want to be inclusive. We want to include as many people from different backgrounds working on the region, in particular, as we said, scholars, younger scholars in particular from the region. And our next principle is balance. So we want to sort of ideally strive to be a forum for debate. I think oftentimes on panels and events focused on Central Asia, there's little too much sort of agreement between different speakers. And I think there's definitely room for constructive debate on key issues in the region, such as, is secularism a system that provides security, or is it a system that creates insecurity for certain individuals? What is the sort of, is China's role in the region positive or negative? These are very simplistic questions and they can be taken from a number of different angles, but we're very interested to have sort of constructive debates between people with different opinions on these questions. Next is equity, and this is something we feel very strongly about, which is that, oftentimes knowledge production on the region is very exploitative, and there's this hierarchical relationship, particularly between outside scholars who come into the region and sort of exploit local researchers, research assistants, and end up using the knowledge that they, in fact, the local researchers are really producing, and, use it to forward their own career goals. And so that's why we're very, in our approach. We're trying to be very inclusive, and anyone who works with us on research projects will be given sort of full credit for research reports outputs from that data collection process, which is why we've worked as hard as we can with our researchers, with Sher and Aruke, to include them as much as possible in writing the reports, doing the data analysis. And Sher was, in fact, integral to the analysis that was put into the reports. He's going to talk about that in a little bit. Our final one, which leads me into Bradley's sort of presentation, is empiricism. We're very we feel very strongly about the need for data-driven approaches. This doesn't necessarily mean it has to be quantitative, although our initial data sets are obviously quantitative in nature. We are very interested in working with those who are using qualitative approaches that I've used myself in my research, anthropologists and sociologists and others. But we do feel that a data-driven approach is the sort of the most productive way to get at the contemporary and historical sort of key questions facing the region. So, with that, I'll lead into Bradley's presentation about the data sets that we've produced and released with our launch.
Great, thank you for that introduction, Ed. As Edward's put it, we have framed the region looking at its linkages with Asia, particularly India and China, but also with Japan, South Korea. With the data sets, we really wanted to push a research agenda, again, that was very data-driven. Often there are a lot of assumptions of the region, particularly see common points being thrown about that are not necessarily the case. So one of these was when we thought about developing a tracker for arms transfers in the region. We really started to wonder about this narrative of Sino-Russian competition in the region. And really, Ed and I started thinking about, has this competition really taken place yet? Let's look at the numbers on this. So we looked at some of the existing arms data transfer sets, such as the ones collected by CIPRI. We found that they were really missing almost 30 or 40% of the transfers that we've managed to add by going through Chinese language sources and regional reporting, which really supplemented those data sets and allowed us to really unpack the numbers. So what we saw was, rather than Sino-Russian competition in the arms market, for example, that actually has not taken place yet. In fact, Russia's arms transfers have remained remarkably stable, fluctuating between 47% of the total arms share or 52%, so barely a 5% switch. China, on the other hand, its share of the market's grown from 1.5% to almost 14% today. So you would think that means that China must be eating into Russia's market share. But again, it's not the case. Actually, China's really been eating into NATO allies such as France, Turkey, and Germany, and also into Ukraine. So these are the markets that China's actually been pushing out, which actually serves Russia's short-term interests in a lot of ways. So some of this data actually helps explain why there hasn't been stronger Russian pushback so far, although we're entering a stage at which China will begin to start eating into the Russian market share now that it's pushed out other countries. China, nevertheless, is still a very significant player in the region. And as we saw with the recent Pentagon report, China actually has military facilities now in Tajikistan. What we know about the Tajik-Afghan border, especially from the leaked Xinjiang papers last year with the secret speeches made by Xi in the region, is that essentially China has identified the Wakhan corridor in particular as a potential threat, either from the US withdrawing from Afghanistan and the threat of instability spilling across into the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, which China is worried about, or whether it's from foreign fighters returning from Syria, waging a potential threat. So this has really led to a securitization where China has now been investing in border security in Tajikistan. It's began transferring a lot more military aid, and particularly armored personnel carriers and such things that help with border patrols, maintaining border posts, and also a lot of interoperability now between paramilitary units. So you have China's People's Armed Police now doing joint training exercises with National Guard units in the region. of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. And Kyrgyzstan has actually been training in Xinjiang as well with these paramilitary units. Alongside that, China has actually started building its own multilateral frameworks for security in the region. So one of these is the quadrilateral cooperation and coordination mechanism. This includes Pakistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and they do a lot of counter-terror training and drills. So this is interesting, where it's the first time that China has really branched out from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, of which Russia is a significant partner. So this might show a more Chinese-oriented foreign policy where it's really pursuing its own interests, independent of Russia, which is an interesting development and certainly one to watch in the coming years. The US, meanwhile, its security assistance has really plummeted in the region. Over a decade ago, it was at a high of 450 million in transfers. Today, it's just 11 million, making it quite less than a percentile of the total arms market of the region. So it's really become Russia and China vying for influence in terms of arms. Interestingly, the region, we talk about in the report whether the region has sought balance between its partners to give it some strategic autonomy. But actually, Russia has still maintained its share of the region. So we have Kazakhstan, for example. Russia still accounts for 68% of the country's arms sales, which is a huge sum. And China, it falls very far behind, around 10%. So there's still a long way to go before the region could even attain balance. Well, especially in the case of Kazakhstan. It's also true for Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, which mainly rely on transfers that are donated. Often, actually, with pre-existing arms sales, they only look at sales. They don't take into account aid, military aid. So EDNI's data sets actually take this into account as a form of transfer as well, which really, again, skews the data in favor of Russia. The most balanced portfolios are actually Turkmenistan, where Russia and China are only third and fourth place, respectively. First is Turkey, which is probably unsurprising. Turkey and Turkmenistan have had long-term security cooperation. Turkey gives Turkmenistan everything from patrol ships to armored personnel carriers. But the second biggest seller was very surprising when we started putting the data together, but it's actually Italy. So Italy's actually been transferring huge amounts of jets in recent years. Now, of course, this might not be a long-term engagement, or there might be less strategic interest for Italy in the long run when compared with Russia, China, and Turkey. But nevertheless, it remains in second place. There was actually a EurasiaNet report the other week that I thought was great terming of it. They call Turkmenistan the United Nations of Arms, because its arms parades often have weapons from every corner of the globe, from Japan to India to China to the US. So it's definitely the most balanced portfolio in the region. And then there's Uzbekistan. It's always tried to have an independent foreign policy, independent of Russia in particular. But even now, since 2016, with the transition taking place, Uzbekistan, has actually embarked on a very ambitious military modernization program, which has meant that it's actually taking more arms for Russia than ever before. So as Uzbekistan transitions, it might lead to more dependence on Russia. And we'll see how that develops in the coming years. The other thing we tried quantifying was looking at military drills. We'd always seen about growing exercises between the region, between China, or between the region and Russia, but we'd never seen it comprehensively quantified. We found that looking back over reporting over the years, we've put together a total of 227 joint exercises, which is a significant amount. So Russia and Russian-led organizations, including the Commonwealth of Independent States and the Collective Security Treaty Organization, they've organized 91 in total, as you can see in the table. The US and NATO have also had the second biggest share, actually, accounting for 85 of these exercises. And in China, either bilaterally, which has been a trend in recent years, since 2014, there's been a large rise in China's bilateral drills, or through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. China has collectively organized 36 of these drills. Military exercises are actually growing in the region as well. We saw that in 2015, it reached a peak of 18 in total. So the region and military diplomacy is becoming more active. The other thing, as I mentioned at the beginning, was China using its paramilitary units, which is very interesting. We look at the facilities in Tajikistan, they're actually controlled by the People's Armed Police, which is the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party, rather than the People's Liberation Army. These paramilitary units are now charged with counter-terror and regime maintenance, mainly, particularly in Xinjiang. So a lot of the drills they're doing in the region now, working as part of their Cooperation 2019 drills. They've been working with the Kyrgyz, Uzbek, and Tajik National Guards. And I think that's a trend we'll see growing as China takes more interest in guarding its frontiers in Xinjiang. And then India as well. We've started to map out what India's inroads are to the region in terms of security. It's been a fairly, it's had a very minor influence in the region, I would say. But in recent years, it's started to grow. It's organized 11 military exercises, 9 of which were in the past 5 years. So it's really the last 5 years where India has really started to emerge as a security actor. But I would say that the drills it's been organizing have been very low level, with 100 personnel roughly involved in each. So it's important not to overstate India's growth in terms of security in the region, but it's nevertheless a trend worth monitoring. Long term though, the projection seems set that China will rise as an arms supplier in the region. It's investing huge amounts in R&D, which is allowing it to become a globally competitive arms seller, even competing with the US and Russia in some senses. In the region, for example, China is bringing new technologies that have been previously inaccessible to it. For example, armed drones. China can actually supply them without the restrictions and regulations that other competitors like the US and Israel have. And it can also supply them much cheaper, even if they were competing with it. China has a lot more interest in security now in the region. One of the projects that we've started developing, that Sher will talk a little bit more about once I'm done, is the protest tracker. One of the trends that was interesting is we mapped since January 2018, there have been 97 anti-China protests. These are in relations to either mining projects or the situation in Xinjiang and various other instances. Xenophobia is pretty rampant. I mean, 30% and 35% of Kazaks and Kyrgyz respectively have very negative views of China, according to recent polling with the Kennan Institute. So China will have more incentive to grow as a security provider, either in terms of military cooperation, security cooperation, or even allowing its private military corporations to enter the region and protect their businesses. A lot of riots have been taking place with Chinese workers often caught in skirmishes with locals. So these will be the kind of developments that lead to Chinese workers in Central Asia actually pushing for China to intervene on their behalf to protect their investments. So this will be a dynamic that we're seeing around the world, where China's private military companies are entering, including in Africa and Latin America. And it will likely be the same for Central Asia. So I will lead on to Sher, and he'll talk a little bit more about the protest tracker.
Thank you, Bradley. Just before that, if anyone does have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A, and Ben will sort of moderate the discussion if we have time at the end. So I think Sher's now going to talk about the Central Asia Protest Tracker. This is an original data set that we collected over the past few months using sort of searches of the Central Asian local language media, and also using some of the data collected by ACLED, which is another non-profit organization that collects data on different violent events and protests around the world. So we have in the data set 980 protests logged over the past 2.5 years in the 5 Central Asian countries that are then sort of coded by protest type, coded by issue, and coded by response type, amongst other things. So it's all presented on this interactive map that I'm sure Ben will show you while Sher speaks, but with that, I'll turn it over to Sher to sort of talk about the results of what we found.
Thank you, Ed, for the introduction. I'll do a quick dive country by country, and I'll start with my home country of Tajikistan, where we recorded 27 protests, and half of them occurred in Gbao in the east part of the country, also known as the Pamirs. And those protests were aimed at the actions of law enforcement and security agencies against the local authority figures. And the dynamic reflects the long-standing tension between the national government, the central government in Tajikistan, and the region long known for its separatism and opposition to the central government. A second point that was pretty unique to Tajikistan was the several protests that we recorded that were aimed against the opposition and the organizations accused of harboring the opposition, namely the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and the government of Iran. Finally, despite the growing presence of China in the country, what was surprising is that we were able to record only one protest aimed against the growing Chinese expansion in the country. I spent about half a year just recently in Tajikistan on the ground, and the anti-China sentiment there is growing, especially in the light of recent implications by Beijing that the Pamirs, the eastern part of Tajikistan, historically have belonged to China. And yet we do not see as many protests aimed against the Chinese government in Tajikistan. Moving on to Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan was the most difficult to research. I don't think that statement surprises anyone who follows Central Asia just because of how close politically Turkmenistan is and how little information actually comes out of the country. We were able to record only 9 protests, and all of them reflect the ongoing food crisis in Turkmenistan and how coronavirus only exacerbates that crisis despite the national government still denying the presence of the virus in their country. Every single of the 9 protests that we recorded were aimed against the local government and its inadequate response to the current food shortage. None of the protests were aimed at the national government, which again reflects how tight the grip is of the national government on political expression in Turkmenistan. Uzbekistan is clearly opening up with Mirziyoyev's rule and ongoing political reforms. We can see that in the growing number of protests happening in Uzbekistan. Over half of the protests that we found in Uzbekistan are turned around the issues of land and property, as the government has been pushing for urban redevelopment and beautification, and the compulsory enforcement bureau has been evicting people and demolishing property. All of that leads to a pretty violent response from protesters, from people burning themselves or acting out violently against the working groups coming from the government. This dynamic is especially evident in Tashkent, in the capital of Uzbekistan, where we recorded 11 protests centered around new construction sites. There's an interesting contrast between the type of protests that we saw in Uzbekistan and the government response to them. 28% of protests in Uzbekistan were qualified by us as violent. That's the largest share of protests to be violent in all 5 countries, and yet the government response to protests was the most constructive in Uzbekistan, with half of the protests meriting some sort of constructive response from the government, whether it's a meeting with the protesters or a promise to solve the issue that people were protesting against. In Kazakhstan, where we recorded 520 protests, we see the opposite dynamic. Only 8% of the protests became violent, and yet in 30% of the cases, the largest share among the 5 countries, the government responded with the use of force and arrests. Kazakhstan also has the largest share of protests among the 5 countries to be aimed against the national government, 38%, which I think reflects the transition of power the country is undergoing, with the President Nazarbayev stepping down and the perceived lack of mandate of President Tokayev, and the regime is currently on high alert. All of that is evident in the type of issues that we saw in protests raised in Kazakhstan. Over a third of the protests centered around the issues of democracy, transition of power, and human rights. Finally, the issue of Chinese expansion, mentioned earlier by Bradley, primarily featured both in Kazakhstan with 51 protests against the Chinese expansion, and Kyrgyzstan, where we saw 41 protests against Chinese expansion. The issue of Chinese expansion in Kyrgyzstan is closely tied to Kyrgyzstan's extraction industries and its impact on the environment. 10% of the protests recorded in Kyrgyzstan had a link to the negative impacts on the environment of the country. It has been the most prominent issue in Kyrgyzstan. However, that title goes to the issues of justice, which included issues of police brutality, arrests, the proceedings of the justice system, and release of political prisoners. Despite the fact that almost 60% of protests were directed against the government, be that national or local government, the government responded in a pretty balanced manner, with 38% of the response being neutral and 33% of response being constructive, be that a meeting with the protesters or a promise to solve the issue. Over the coming month, coronavirus will likely accelerate some of the key protest dynamics in the region, with unemployment rising, with remittances from Russia falling, and state welfare in all 5 countries being pushed to its limits. Another important factor that we're going to be paying close attention to that we think is going to affect the protest activity in Central Asia is the ongoing transition of power in Kazakhstan, the ongoing political reforms in Uzbekistan, as well as the impact that the upcoming parliamentary elections in Kyrgyzstan are going to have in the country.
Perfect. Thank you, Sher, for that fantastic overview of our findings. And you can find more about that in our reports. Happy to answer questions, as we said. And we also want this to be a collaborative effort. I think one person's already pointed out that we put Taboshar in, which is supposed to be in Sugd province in Tajikistan. So for some reason, it didn't end up in Horog. There may be some mistakes within our data set. We are humble and we welcome people's corrections, feedback. And if you find missing entries, things that you think that we should include in our data set that we haven't, then please let us know. Also, if you're collecting data on similar issues yourself and you want to collaborate, we would be very interested in that. We're also planning to hopefully collaborate with scholars who are working on these issues from qualitative methods, like from anthropologists and sociologists who are looking at protest movements. And, I think we could have a productive collaboration that would bring together this data set that is obviously quite large and is taking things from a very high sort of level to sort of studies that are more focused and, can provide real value and nuance to the analysis of our data. So as with everything in Oxus, we really want this to be collaborative. So please get in touch if you're interested in working with us in any way on this. And with that, I'll turn over to Nargis Kassenova from Harvard University, who is on our advisory council. Thank you, Nargis.
Thank you very much, Ed. Well, it's a really wonderful project, and I see that you already received very good questions and comments. So I'll do my part fast, and then we can move to the real business. So first of all, I wanted to congratulate the Oxus founders, the team, on the launch, and I very much like the clear focus on Central Asia. As Ed, you rightly pointed out, Central Asia is usually lumped to some other bigger region, and it's easy to lump Central Asia with the nearby regions because we do have strong linkages, affinities with them. So it's really good to actually put Central Asia center stage. I very much like the approach that you outlined, the framing of the region, the kind of moving the setting a little bit toward Asia. Because I think it does reflect the ongoing developments where the region is actually heading, and I like very much the values that guide the project, your mega project. And I think and I also like the fact that you chose affairs rather than studies in the title, and kind of trying to make it, a platform where different communities, not only academics but journalists and others can sort of feed off each other's research. So I think it's great, and I think the timing is great. There are very there are many interesting developments to study, and there are many good people, especially young researchers, who can do excellent and fresh research. So in a sense, I feel that the stars are lined up for Oxus and your success. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the big trends in the region, and I enlisted 5, and they will probably, anybody who is following the region will kind of find them familiar, but let me do it nevertheless. And well, the first trend is desovietization, continuing desovietization, and interestingly, it is sort of going in counterbalance to what's happening in counter-trend to what's happening in Russia, that is still very much attached to the Soviet glory and doesn't know how to overcome that. And we see new generations that grew up during the independence period, and they are different. They socialize differently. Their discourses are different, and I feel that we still don't know enough, because the research still is mainly done through Russian language, via Russian language, and there is little knowledge on what's happening in this, in these communities speaking national languages. What are the discourses, for example, on China and on Russia and another big issue. So that's one trend, and I feel that there is room for studying the developments. The second trend is the rise of China and what it triggered. The responses it triggered inside the region, and Sher mentioned the anti-Chinese protests. The developments, the dynamics it triggered, outside the region that has an impact on the region, usually people discuss, what's Russia's response, what's EU response, what's US response, but there are important Asian actors as well. Japan, South Korea, India, and I think it is underexplored. I think there is a very important dynamics going on there, and I'm very happy that Oxus will be kind of trying to shed light on that part. Well, of course, the third trend is Uzbekistan. There is, opening up. Uzbekistan is improving relations with neighbors. It's carrying out reforms, and in a way following in the footsteps of Kazakhstan in becoming this Asian developmental state. And it's also very, very interesting development, something to kind of to explore further. There is a trend that is probably less pronounced now, but I'm very happy you're tackling it already. There is already a certain political awakening of people. Of course, we don't see it to the extent we see it in the rest of the former Soviet Union, and Belarus is the latest big example. But it is a Eurasian trend, and with some lag, I think Central Asia will be also entering that stage. And it's your data set. The Central Asian protest track is incredibly timely. And the fifth trend that I wanted to mention, it is linked to the trend of political awakening of people, and it is the search by regimes to find new ways to govern and control societies and try to develop new tools, and the use of digital tools it is a new trend, and it's an important trend to watch. So so these are sort of my top five that I can offer in terms of what can be studied. I think what we are really missing is research on how the region functions inside. What I mean is there is a lot written on Russia Central Asia relations, or EU Central Asia, in China, even China Central Asia. Yeah, there is a lot of articles, there are books and so on and so forth, but there is nothing on Kazakh-Kyrgyz relations, for example. Yeah, how do they work at different levels? And I don't mean just the kind of the official level, you know, the agreements, treaties, so meetings, whatnot, but actually, how do these relations work on the ground? Yes, and how issues are addressed? How are they perceived and addressed by the parties? How supply chains work, or what's happening at the people-to-people level? So what is actually happening inside the region between us, and I think it's really the job waiting for, you know, young researchers, and especially young researchers from the region. I think it would be really great if they start kind of working on these different issues and do the granular research that Oxus Society is trying to encourage, granular on the ground data collecting. And one last point. I also want to congratulate you on the visuals, how pretty, clean and nice the website looks, and the data sets, and I think it's also an important aspect. So okay.
Thank you, Nargis. Thank you. That's and I didn't mention it, but sort of picking up on the themes that Nargis sort of outlined, you know, we do have a number of channels, and as we fill content on the website, these channels will start to be introduced. And one of them is focused on changing Uzbekistan. One of them is focused on China's rising role in the region, and one of them is focused on digital surveillance and sort of the ways in which, as you mentioned, you know, particularly, you know, Chinese made, but other, you know, Israeli surveillance technologies and smart cities are being retooled for, you know, purposes of, you know, making governance more efficient on the one hand, but also potentially, you know, strengthening the surveillance capacities of different states. So you can find those channels on our website. We'll be introducing them as we get content to fill them. The other thing to mention is that I should have mentioned is that we're not only focusing on the contemporary region. You know, we have we're interested in input from anthropologists, people studying culture. We have an article on rock music in Uzbekistan on our website. We have a review of Scott Levy's recent book on the Bukharan crisis, which looks at early modern Central Asia. And we have a number of forthcoming articles that will also be you know, written by historians and anthropologists. So we're certainly, we don't want to only study the sort of changing dynamics of the region, although this is obviously fascinating. We also want to look at sort of historical dynamics as well. But with that, I'll turn it over to Ben for the Q&A, because I know we only have.
Yeah, so we've gotten quite a few questions about the protest tracker. So I'll maybe bundle a few of these together. So are there plans to update the protest and arms trade trackers in the future? There's a question asking whether there are plans to record any kind of online dissatisfaction, sort of somewhere separately on a different kind of map or visual presentation. And one that we just got is there a plan of mapping out protests of Central Asians out of Central Asia, for example, Russia, Turkey, or the USA?
So I guess I can take that at first, and then others can chip in. Yes, there is a plan to update it on a continuing basis. I think we will probably be updating it every quarter, or at least releasing a sort of updated data set every quarter. We also plan, hopefully, to go back potentially in time. Initially, we had hoped to collect data till 2015, but then it became very obvious that we wouldn't be able to do that just because of the sheer number of protests and the fact that we were four people working on this, all of whom are doing other things at the same time. So hopefully, going forward, we'll be able to expand historically, and we definitely plan to update it on an ongoing basis, just to sort of map out. Particularly, the interesting thing is, as Sher mentioned, sort of how is COVID-19 affecting sort of you know, these protests. maybe we could potentially expand to Central Asian protests abroad. That's obviously been an interesting theme, particularly in countries like Turkmenistan. We've just recently seen a wave of protests at the UN and other places, embassies and things around the world. So that's certainly something we would consider. In terms of online protests, it's very difficult to map those visually. And like, I think our protest tracker is very much only focused on sort of protests that happen in physical space. We don't claim that this sort of represents resistance in general to the Central Asian governments. You know, there's particularly in more closed societies, there are different ways one can protest and resist. We definitely recognize that that exists. It's just very difficult to get at. But we would certainly be interested in thinking that through, and certainly interested in, particularly in these collaborations we were talking about, in working with people who, you know, maybe through their anthropological work are getting at these more sort of what James Scott called hidden transcripts, right? These sort of more subtle ways of protesting. I don't know if any of the others want to chip in.
We have a question that maybe Bradley would be able to take on. In 2016, Kazakhstan was shaken by protests against land reforms that many feared would allow foreigners, especially Chinese, to take over farmlands. Why do you think the persecution of Uyghurs and Kazakhs in Xinjiang did not spark similar protests?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, as you say, in 2016, there were huge protests related to land issues in the region, in Kazakhstan. You know, this has long been a contentious issue there, with China renegotiating territories after the end of the Cold War. So these kind of legacies of the idea of China seizing land has really been prominent in discourse, not just in Kazakhstan, but across the region as well. So the backlash there was to be expected, and you would think the same would apply for the subject of the Uighurs and Kazakhs being persecuted in Xinjiang, but that doesn't appear to have been the case. One thing we noticed with the tracker, and according to regression analysis by Sher, was that actually protests related to China or related to the issue of Xinjiang were more likely to receive a violent response from the Kazakh government, either police cracking down or issuing penalties to protesters. So they're much more aggressive on cracking down on those type of protests. And also Kazakhstan in the region had the most violent responses in general. Over 30%, I believe it was, of protests that take place in the region have a hardline police response. So that's one important factor of it. The other is, of course, control regulation of media related to the situation in Xinjiang or to China in general. We've also seen the Kazakh government cracking down on activists, groups like Atatürk, who are doing work collecting data on the situation there. So it's a very good question, and it's one that I think perhaps Nargis can offer more on the ground of kind of perceptions of what's happening there, if she can.
Yeah, if I can add a little bit. Well, I think these are different saying. Okay, let me a little bit dangle. Land is sacred. Yeah, these people have this special affinity to the land, and you know, we see what's happening in Azerbaijan, Armenia. Yeah, people are ready to die over over land, and so the perception was that Kazakhs will be losing that land that was protected for generations and generations by their ancestors. So it's sort of the last thing that people could lose. So it was okay. The riches of the like the natural resources, they're all sold off, and but there's corruption and all that, but at least we keep the land. So if the land goes, that's it. So that's why there was such a big emotional response, and people were ready to go and protest despite the fact that they were facing detentions, arrests, punishment, and so on. So on the Uighurs and Kazakhs in the detention centers, in this re-education camps, well, the persecution of Uighurs, it hasn't been a big issue. Yeah? Uighurs have been persecuted for decades, and Kazakh government has been complicit complicit in this campaign. But it's the kind of the inclusion of Kazakhs that created an issue for the Kazakhstani society. So it's more like co-ethnics rather than violation of human rights. You know, we have breaches in human rights, you know, in the country itself, and you know, we don't have people protesting, right? So it was more like, okay, our co-ethnics are being mistreated, which sort of created this vibe and resulted in the protests. So it's not to the same scale, because you know, it's one thing losing the land, and you know, it's the big thing, and mistreatment of co-ethnics, that's a smaller issue.
We have a question that might be a good one for Sher to answer, which is, how do you sort of evaluate a protest as such for the protest tracker? And does it include protests that were not repressed and did not receive any institutional or political attention or you know, response, basically?
Good question, and we do go into more detail on that in the report published on our website, but essentially we limited ourselves to the following definition of protest. A protest action is a public expression of objection towards an idea or action of an individual or institution, including state organs, businesses, NGOs, and foreign governments, which occur in a physical space. We did record the protests that did not merit any sort of response from the government, that were totally ignored and sort of forced the protesters to, you know, disperse in the end without receiving any sort of response. And we coded that sort of response as neutral. And you can find that data in our tracker. To the larger point of how we're collecting that data, because of the nature of data collection, you know, we heavily relied on publicly available news sources, as well as ACLED data. It means that some of the protests that happened in remote geographic locations or were not considered to be newsworthy were probably missed by us.
So we have an interesting question from one Robin Swearingen, the chairman of the Oxus board, which I feel like we are obliged to answer. So Bradley mentioned that China is increasingly positioned to ensure Central Asian security, but that Central Asian societies generally fear and oppose China's influence. Some Western governments, including the US, increasingly have anti-CCP rhetoric. Have there been any notable initiatives by Western countries to support Central Asian societies' opposition to their government's cooperation with China on security? For example, have US aid or other agencies expressed interest in backing civil society efforts to pressure governments to withdraw from the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for example? I'm wondering if this is an escalating diplomatic, political issue that is attracting increased attention and resources as the world becomes more and more aware of the CCP's contributions to repress ethnic minorities, even outside its borders.
Well, I guess I can start with that one. It's a great question. I can't say I know of any direct funding. That's certainly something I would be interested in looking into. But I can tell you there's certainly a lot of US government and agencies related to the US government interest, particularly in the issue of xenophobia, and particularly pushback against the Belt and Road Initiative. This is something that's worth reading. Daniel Markey's new book, China's Western Horizon, because he really engages with this idea that, you know, the US right now has several policy options ahead of it of how it deals with China in strategically competitive regions. Either it can become a direct competitor, that would mean, you know, putting its money where its mouth is and its own infrastructure investment and such things to push back against China and actually offering an alternative. It could try and co-opt and work together with China on the Belt and Road, finding grounds for mutual cooperation, which of course there are. Infrastructure is beneficial to the region, both in terms of ensuring security and stability and economic development and prosperity. So there are certainly grounds for cooperation, depending on the nature of the projects, which goes to the competitive dynamic. Either the US as well could take a very critical approach. It could actually push back against Belt and Road by doing exactly what you've outlined in your question, which would be funding opposition movements or engaging with civil society that helps push back against China's influence in the region. Or it could also just find, one thing I would say actually to unpack this is the Belt and Road is of course part of the problem with it at the moment, and part of why we're seeing a lot of pushback against it is the nature of it, in the terms that it's usually non-transparent deals, which are always seen as buying China political influence with the regimes themselves, but not giving benefit to the broader population. Now, often it's not just a case of China pushing its weight in the region, but sometimes various regimes actually pull China into the region for their own ends. I mean, look at, or co-opt projects for their own ends. The case of Tajikistan with the highway that was built that ended up having toll roads installed, which were costing the locals money to use the roads, but the money was being funneled off to the Cayman Islands, the bank accounts connected to the ruling regime. So these are kind of problems that China is going to have to address itself. I mean, part of the reason for all this pushback is this very design of the Belt and Road. So one thing would be that Marky also outlines in the book is the idea of constructive critique of the Belt and Road, actually making China aware how it could actually make smarter investments to make sure that these projects are beneficial for locals, they do build up political goodwill, and that they do ensure that regimes in the region and corruption aren't just hollowing out these projects, which is not in China's interests. It's certainly not in the interest of ensuring stability and security in the region either.
We have a question from Eugene Husky. Is there not a halt or perhaps even a reversal of the de-Russification in terms of language and education? One thinks of the impact not just of the scale of labor migration from at least 3 Central Asian countries to Russia, but also the increase in Russian language education, whether in the opening of more Russian language schools or the launching of branches of Russian higher education institutions in the region. So yeah, basically, is de-Russification, has it halted or even reversed throughout Central Asia?
I guess it's to me, since I mentioned Sovietization. Okay, I'm not an expert on languages, but it seems to me that overall the role of the Russian language has been receding. We see, people in the streets speaking in Kazakh, Kyrgyz, and so on. But you're right. There are these trends. But to me, it seems to me that these are groups of people who see kind of their future, their life strategies linked to the mastery of Russian, the same way as there are groups of people who see the learning English as a very important instrument of kind of building the life that they want to live. So it's becoming more fragmented. So if before, like in Russian, you could you can get by throughout the region. Now it's not the case. So I would say yes, you're right, but overall I do think that we see de-Russification of the region.
I could quickly add on behalf of things that I see in Tajikistan. In mid-2000s, the Tajik government nixed Russian from the list of official languages in the country, and we, as Nargis pointed out, we definitely see de-Russification of education in Tajikistan. And currently, I believe for 2018, the statistic is that only 15% of all of school students were enrolled in a Russian language class, which in the end really impacts the labor migrants. Tajikistan heavily relies on labor migrants and the remittances that they send from Russia, but because there's not enough quality Russian language education in the country, it impacts their ability to secure employment in Russia and then offer some sort of economic relief to their compatriots.
I think that pretty much wraps up the Q&A if Ed wants to do some concluding remarks.
Oh, well, I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you for everyone who's been involved with building Oxus thus far. I did receive that very interesting question about youth. I think probably it's such an important theme, and I'm very happy that Nargis picked up on it and Sher picked up on in a very interesting piece in the Calvert Journal recently, sort of, the sort of new generation in Tajikistan. I think this is a very important question. So I think it probably warrants an entire event panel, which we will now think about and put our heads together and put together for the coming weeks. So I think that may be one of our next events coming up. Our next event is actually next week on October 8th at 8:45 in the morning DC time, where we'll be talking about the elections in Kyrgyzstan in an event that's co-organized with the Carnegie Endowment, Central Asia Program, and Radio for Europe. Details are on our website. So we hope you can join here, and please follow us on Twitter. Keep looking at our website. We posted another article this morning on extremism and migration, and the fallacy, the sort of ways in which framing migration as leading to radicalization can lead to the securitization of migrants by Koresh Schenk, professor at Nazarbayev University in Astana or Nur Sultan. So please keep on following us. Email us if you have any further questions. Join the researcher directory, and stay in touch. So with that, we'll end the event, and thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to all the panelists.